There is a border in the sea between Korea and Japan that the water itself has never recognized. On a map, the two nations sit barely 100 miles apart. Two flags, two languages that share almost nothing a listener could follow from one to the other. Two written scripts, and a history so heavy that to this day, a single word spoken carelessly can sour a room in Seoul or in Tokyo. We are taught, gently and from very young, that these are two ancient and separate peoples, that the distance between them runs all the way down, that whatever it is that makes a person Korean and whatever it is that makes a person Japanese must be old and deep and written somewhere we are not allowed to edit. And then, in 2018, a team of geneticists sat down with the actual DNA, Korean, Japanese, and Han Chinese, and measured precisely how far apart these people really are. What they found did not match the story we are told. This video is about that measurement, about how genetically different Korean and Japanese people actually are once you stop looking at flags and start looking at chromosomes. It is not the answer most people expect, and it is not a small distance from what they expect either. But to understand why the numbers land where they do, we have to move slowly. Because this is exactly the kind of question that gets answered badly and in bad faith all the time. So I am going to walk it carefully, and I am going to show you every study by name. Here is the one promise I will make you up front. If you stay to the end, there is a single date, one number, roughly 3,000 years old, that quietly changes how you read the entire rivalry between these two nations. Most people have never heard it. If that is the kind of thing you came for, consider subscribing. Then let's begin. To understand how different any two human groups are, we first have to understand how similar all of us already are. Because the baseline is genuinely strange and almost no one carries it in their head correctly. Take any two people on Earth. Pick the two who look most unlike each other that you can picture. Line up their genomes, letter against letter. They will be identical across roughly 99.9% of it. Nearly everything that builds a human being is shared, exactly and without exception, across all of us. The traits we spend so much energy on, the skin and the eyes and the hair and the shape of a face, ride on a thin slice of the 0.1% that is left over. And even that thin slice is younger than it feels. Every person alive outside of Africa carries a faint genetic echo of Neanderthals, a percent or two of the genome, first traced and confirmed when Svante Pabo's team sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010. We are, all of us, recently out of Africa, recently mixed, recently scattered across the map. On the scale that geneticists actually work in, human populations are not ancient strangers to one another. They are close cousins who have been apart for a remarkably short time. There is one more piece of the baseline, and it is the most important one. Back in 1972, the geneticist Richard Lewontin asked a simple question. When you add up all the genetic variation in our species, how much of it sits between the broad groups we call races and how much sits inside them? The answer he found has held up for half a century. The overwhelming majority of human genetic variation, around 85% of it, is found within any single population. Only a small remainder separates one group from another at all. Two strangers from the same town differ across most of the same genome that supposedly separates continents. That is the unit to keep in mind for everything that follows. When geneticists say one group differs from another by some percentage, they do not mean that one group is missing genes the other one has. They mean something subtler. Of all the genetic variation these populations carry, what fraction is accounted for by which group a person belongs to, rather than by the ordinary differences between any two individuals? It is a measure of how much the label tells you. And for almost every comparison in our species, the answer is the same, far less than people assume. So when we ask how different Korean and Japanese people are, we are not asking whether they are different kinds of human. They are not. We are asking something far narrower. How within that last thin and shared sliver, two neighboring populations drifted just far enough apart to be told apart at all. And here is the image to hold on to, because we will come back to it more than once. Picture ancestry not as a line, not a ladder with someone older or purer waiting at the bottom of it, but as a braided river. One body of water, spreading across a wide floodplain, splitting into channels that wander apart, loop, and rejoin. Seen from above, the channels look like separate rivers, but it is all the same water. No strand of it is the true one. No strand runs upstream of the rest. Keep the river in mind. The whole story turns out to live in the braid. Now to the measurement itself. In 2018, 4 researchers, Yuchen Wang, Dongsheng Liu, Yunjun Chung, and Shuhua Xu, published a study in the journal Hereditas with a plain, almost clerical title: The Genetic Structure, Divergence, and Admixture of Han Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Populations. They gathered genome-wide data from 182 Han Chinese individuals. They added 90 Japanese. They added 100 Korean. And to keep themselves honest, they set all of those East Asian genomes against 630 more people, drawn from 8 other populations around the world. The first result is the one that almost everyone gets backwards. Against the backdrop of the entire planet, Han Chinese, Korean, and Japanese people do not fall into 3 tidy groups. They collapse into one. Held up beside Europeans, beside Africans, beside South Asians, the 3 East Asian populations cluster so tightly together that the gaps between them nearly disappear. The thing we are trained from childhood to read as 3 separate peoples reads, at the scale of the world, as a single, closely related family. There is an everyday version of this finding, and most people in the region already half know it. Stand a Han Chinese, a Korean, and a Japanese person together, strangers to you, and say nothing. And very often, you simply cannot tell, by looking alone, which is which. The authors note exactly this in plain language. The 3 groups share so much in appearance, in language, and in culture that the surface gives almost nothing away. The DNA, at the scale of the world, agrees with the street. What looks like sameness from the outside turns out to be real closeness underneath. And the study put a hard number on just how close. The genetic difference between any 2 of the 3 groups, Han Chinese, Korean, Japanese, is less than 1% of their total genetic diversity. Less than 1%. To feel how small that is, you need the comparison the authors themselves reached for. The difference between any one of these East Asian groups and a European population is around 10%. 10% against less than 1. Written in DNA, the distance from Seoul to Tokyo is something like 1/10 or less of the distance from Seoul to Paris. That is the headline finding. Korean and Japanese people, by this measurement, are not far apart at all. They are among the closest national populations that have ever been formally placed side by side and measured. And if the story ended there, it would be a comfortable story, and a quietly dishonest one. Because it does not end there. The very same study found something that cuts in the other direction, and skipping past it to leave you with only the cleaner headline would be exactly the kind of corner cutting this entire channel exists to refuse. Here is the complication, and you have to hold it in the same hand as the last one. Less than 1% is not 0. When Wang and his colleagues zoomed all the way in, when they stopped comparing East Asians to the world and started comparing East Asians only to each other, the 3 groups did separate. Cleanly. On a genome-wide plot, Han Chinese, Korean, and Japanese individuals fall into their own distinct clusters. You can sort a person into the right group from the DNA alone, with very little ambiguity, using nothing more than a panel of ancestry-informative markers. And the clusters track geography almost perfectly. Where a person's ancestors lived maps onto where their genome sits in the data. The peninsula carries its own signature. The islands carry theirs. The mainland carries its own. Geography, the authors concluded, did the dividing. Populations drifting gradually apart in step with the physical distance between them. So two things are true at the very same time, and honesty requires you to keep both. These three populations are extraordinarily close, and they remain reliably distinguishable. Barely apart, but apart. Which leaves the only question that actually matters. If Korean and Japanese people are this similar, what pried them even slightly apart? And, far more importantly, when? The when is the part that should stop you. Wang and his colleagues estimated the most recent common ancestor of these three populations, the moment in the past where the shared gene pool begins to fork, and the figure they arrived at was roughly 3,000 to 3,600 years ago. Sit with that number, because it is far smaller than it has any right to be. 3,000 years ago is not the deep past. It is younger than the Great Pyramid by a full 1,000 years and more. It falls around the era of the Shang dynasty, a time when China already had walled cities, cast bronze, and the first ancestors of its writing system. On the scale of human history, the genetic split between Korean and Japanese people is not ancient at all. It is recent. It is, very nearly, the day before yesterday. Think about what that means for a moment. Two nations that have spent the better part of 2,000 years building separate identities, separate emperors, separate founding myths, separate and often painful histories, are sitting on top of a divergence that is only about 3,000 years old. To put the scale of it plainly, the rivalry is older than the genetic distance it imagines itself to be built on. But a date by itself is only a number. The obvious next question is what actually happened 3,000 years ago. What real event, on the ground, took one shared pool of people and started the braid? And for the Japanese side of that story, we now have an unusually clear answer, and it is written in ancient bone. In 2021, a team led by Cooke, working with Shigeki Nakagome and their colleagues, published a study in Science Advances built on something the 2018 paper never had: actual ancient DNA. They sequenced 12 genomes from people who had lived in the Japanese archipelago across thousands of years, from before farming arrived to long after it had reshaped everything. The picture they recovered is the engine sitting underneath the date. Long before 3,000 years ago, the islands were already inhabited by a people we call the Jomon. They were hunter-gatherers and fishers. They had reached the archipelago and then been sealed off from the continent, isolated by rising seas, for an astonishing stretch of time. Cooke's team estimated that the Jomon split from mainland populations somewhere between 20 and 15,000 years ago. And then they held on. A tiny population, an effective size of only around 1,000 people, carried across millennia in near total isolation. Picture it for a moment. Thin trails of smoke from cooking fires along a wooded coast. The same small thread of people, alone on their islands, for longer than all of recorded history put together. The Jomon are the deep layer, the old strand in the braid. And then, around 3,000 years ago, the boats came. People carrying Northeast Asian ancestry crossed from the continent, by way of the Korean peninsula, and they brought wet rice farming with them. We call this arrival the Yayoi. Imagine the paddies appearing where there had only ever been forest and shore. But here is the part that matters most. They did not simply erase the people already there, the way farming erased the foragers across much of Europe. They mixed. The older people were not wiped from the record, they were folded into it. Some were absorbed into the farming communities. Some held on at the margins. But their genetic signature was carried forward rather than erased, which is why a deep Jomon strand still surfaces in living Japanese genomes today, thousands of years later. The modern Japanese genome, Cooke's team showed, is a blend of layers. The Jomon underneath, this farming wave stacked on top, and then later still, in the Kofun period around 1,700 years ago, a further influx of East Asian ancestry as the first states began to take shape. Now look at what that does to our question. The same farming migration that flowed out of Northeast Asia and across the Korean peninsula is the wave that carried on into Japan. That is the shared trunk. That is why the divergence dates to only about 3,000 years ago, because that is roughly when one stream of continental farmers reached the islands and slowly became part of what we now call Japanese. Korea and Japan are close in the DNA for the most concrete reason imaginable. A large share of their ancestry walked the same road within the last few thousand years. And it would be a mistake to picture the peninsula as nothing but a corridor, an empty road the farmers happened to walk down on their way to the islands. It was not. The Korean peninsula has its own long history of settlement, and its own ancestry is itself a braid of continental streams, with that same northern component running strongest through it. Neither side of this story is a clean origin point for the other. Both are mixtures. Both are recent. Korea is not the raw material that Japan was made from, any more than the reverse. They are two channels of one river, and each carries water the other does not. And the small, stubborn differences, the less than 1%, the clean clusters that geography draws, have a source just as concrete. Japan had the Jomon underneath it, the deep, isolated, old island layer that the mainland and the peninsula simply did not carry in the same measure. The thing that lets a geneticist tell a Japanese genome from a Korean one is not some ancient chasm of separate origins. It is, in large part, that one of them braided in an older island strand the other never touched. There is one more thread, and it runs in the opposite direction from a split. Because the story of these three populations is not only a story of forking. That same 2018 study found that after the initial divergence, the groups did not simply drift on in isolation. There was substantial admixture within all three, continued mixing, layered on top of the first split. And there was distinct introgression of genes from the populations around them, with a northern ancestral component running strongest through the region. The channels of the river, in other words, never stopped touching. They split, and then they leaked into one another and into their neighbors again and again across 3,000 years. This is why the braid is the right picture and a family tree is the wrong one. A tree forks once and the branches never meet again. A braided river forks and rejoins and forks again, strands parting and crossing for as long as the water runs. The line between Korea and Japan is not a single clean cut made once in the Bronze Age. It is a seam that has been split and restitched for as long as there have been people on either side of that narrow sea. So let us gather the whole picture into one place, because this is the turn the entire video has been walking toward. Korean and Japanese people differ across less than 1% of their genetic diversity, set against roughly 10% for the distance to Europe. Their shared ancestry forks only about 3,000 years ago. The fork happened because a single farming migration out of Northeast Asia crossed the peninsula and reached the islands. And the islands already held a deep, isolated population, the Jomon, that the peninsula did not. Closeness from the shared wave, difference from the old island layer, both at once. Both out of the same few thousand years. And on both sides, later centuries of mixing and exchange with neighbors kept tugging the strands back toward one another. This is the date that changes how you read the rivalry. Not because it makes the two nations the same, it does not, and I am not going to pretend that distinct cultures, distinct languages, and real, painful histories dissolve inside a scatterplot. They do not. Identity has never been the same thing as ancestry. A nation is a story that people tell and keep and fight for. It was never a reading taken off a chromosome. But the idea that the difference between Korean and Japanese people is ancient, that it runs all the way down, that it is carved deep and immovable into the blood, that idea simply is not in the data. The blood is recent, and it is mostly shared. It is worth being precise about what this does and does not prove. It does not prove that there is no such thing as a Korean or a Japanese person. There plainly is, and the genome can even point to which. It does not erase the Jomon or the distinct path the islands took. What it proves is narrower and harder to hold on to, that different and separate are not the same word. Two populations can be genuinely distinguishable and still be, by every measure the deep past can take, the same recent people. The distance is real. It is simply young and small and shared on both sides of the water. Come back one last time to the Braided River. One body of water, reaching a wide floodplain about 3,000 years ago, splitting into channels. One channel ran out across the peninsula. One crossed into the islands, and there it gathered up an older strand the others had never met. Seen from above, from the height of flags and borders and 2,000 years of separate history, the channels look like wholly separate rivers. Up close, in the DNA, you can see that the channels are real. They are distinguishable. They are genuinely not the same. But it is one river. No channel is the true one. No channel is older or purer or more whole than the rest. There is no upstream and no downstream of human worth. Only water that parted recently and ran on in slightly different beds. And if you have ever taken one of those ancestry tests and watched it hand you a Korean slice and a Japanese slice and a Chinese slice that all seem to bleed into one another, percentages that never quite resolve into clean borders, now you know why. The test is not broken. It is trying to draw firm lines inside a braid. The strands really are there. They are simply young and tangled, and they share the great majority of their water. What endured here was never a hierarchy. It was a connection, a shared origin that two nations spent 2,000 years learning to forget, and that a few hundred genomes quietly remembered. The lineage held. It was always a web and never a line. That is the part almost no one says out loud. Now you have heard it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, sourced, careful, and named, then this channel is built for exactly that. Thank you for staying to the end.